Derek Moore, a quiet, unassuming truck driver, spent years on the road, blending in with thousands of other drivers. But behind the wheel of his massive rig, he silently claimed 50 lives, each death part of a twisted, calculated plan. For years, no one suspected the man who seemed just like any other trucker. As bodies piled up along highways, it wasn't until the pattern emerged that the authorities realized the deadly truth. Derek Moore wasn't just driving, he was killing. In a quiet town in the heart of America, Derek Moore lived a life that seemed ordinary to anyone who might glance at him. Born with a congenital hearing impairment, Derek's world was one of silence, but this didn't deter him from pursuing his dreams. Growing up, he had always been a solitary figure, his silence making him feel disconnected from others, but also giving him a unique perspective on life. His family, though supportive, could never fully understand the isolation he felt. Derek learned early on that he had to navigate the world differently. The sounds of everyday life, voices, alarms, car horns, were all foreign to him, and he found peace in the stillness that came with his condition. As an adult, Derek turned to truck driving, a job that allowed him to travel long distances while maintaining the quiet he had grown accustomed to. Trucking was more than just a job. It became his escape, his therapy. The open road became his sanctuary, where no one could judge him for his disability, and he could move through the world without the constant pressure to fit in. His truck, a large, imposing vehicle, became a symbol of his independence. With each mile he drove, he found a strange comfort in the solitude of his profession. He didn't need to communicate much with others. His only concern was delivering his cargo on time. His work was routine, almost mechanical. Derek's shifts were long and often took him through desolate highways, where the only sound he could hear was the hum of his truck's engine. He stuck to the same routes night after night, building a quiet rapport with the rhythm of the road. He knew exactly where the potholes were, which turns were sharp, and which rest stops had the best food. To most people, Derek was just another trucker, blending in with thousands of others who shared the same endless miles of highway. But behind this unassuming exterior was a man with a growing obsession, a need to control the road, and a desire to remain unseen. This quiet existence, though, was about to unravel in a way that no one could have predicted. As Derek continued to silently roll across the nation's highways, something far darker was stirring within him. It started with small, seemingly unrelated accidents. At first, they were nothing more than the usual tragedies that came with the dangers of the open road. A vehicle losing control, a driver misjudging a turn, a collision caused by rain or fog. These were things that happened every day on the highways. But over time, the frequency of accidents in certain areas began to raise questions. Investigators initially brushed off the deaths as bad luck or the result of negligent driving, but something about the patterns felt wrong. The victims were often traveling alone, and their vehicles were usually found in remote, desolate stretches of highway where the chances of a witness were slim. What was even more unnerving was how clean the wreckage looked. No sign of other vehicles involved, no obvious causes of the crashes. It was as though the accidents had been carefully orchestrated, leaving no trace of a perpetrator behind. The common thread linking the incidents was the sheer unpredictability of it all. There was no logical explanation, no clear connection between the drivers, yet the deaths kept piling up. As the weeks passed, law enforcement began to notice the troubling coincidences. Many of the crashes seemed to happen in the middle of the night, often along the same stretches of highways where long-haul truckers frequently traveled. There were no skid marks, no sharp turns, no indications that the vehicles had tried to avoid anything. The victims were often found crushed or overturned, their cars wrecked in ways that made it difficult to imagine how the accidents occurred. The mystery deepened when the police started cross-referencing the locations of the crashes with trucking routes, and that's when the unthinkable possibility began to form. On one fateful night, as investigators continued to piece together the puzzle, a truck was spotted near the scene of a particularly deadly crash. At first, no one thought anything of it. It was just another trucker on the road like thousands of others. But as they looked closer, they realized that the locations of many of the recent fatalities aligned with the routes Derek Moore was known to take on his regular shipments. No one could pinpoint it exactly at first, but the more they dug, the more they realized that Derek had driven these routes at the time of every major accident. His truck, they suspected, had been at the heart of each of these disasters. It was as though he was always just a step away from the carnage. Derek Moore's name had never appeared in any investigation before. But now, as the body count grew, and the links between the accidents became undeniable, he emerged as a figure of interest. The authorities had no concrete proof yet, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. The investigation into the string of accidents began to take a more chilling direction when the police started to connect the dots between Derek Moore and the growing number of fatalities. Derek had been a trucker for over a decade, a steady presence on the road with no criminal record and a reputation for being reliable. To most, he was just another driver, doing his job. But the mounting evidence pointed to something much darker. The more investigators looked into Derek's past, the more they realized how his disability might have been a key factor in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern of carnage. Derek had been born deaf, a condition that separated him from the world of sound. To most, this would have been a disadvantage, but to Derek, it was simply a part of his life. He had never known anything else. Growing up, he learned to navigate a world designed for people who could hear. In many ways, Derek was able to adapt, learning to read lips, use visual cues, and rely on his other senses to understand his environment. But in a world filled with horns, sirens, and the constant noise of vehicles, Derek's deafness meant that he couldn't hear the typical signals that drivers relied on to avoid accidents. The thought began to form that Derek's inability to hear the warnings of other vehicles or the sounds of oncoming danger had made him nearly invisible to the very system that was supposed to keep the roads safe. He couldn't hear the screeching of tires as vehicles tried to brake or swerve, nor could he hear the blaring of horns meant to warn him of an imminent crash. In a twisted way, Derek had found a way to use his disability as a deadly advantage. While other truckers relied on auditory cues to stay aware of their surroundings, Derek was free from those distractions, allowing him to act with a chilling level of precision. It wasn't that Derek was unaware of the deaths. In fact, he seemed oddly detached from the horror that surrounded him. The accidents were not random. They followed the routes he frequently traveled. He knew these roads well, each twist and turn, the weak spots where crashes were most likely to occur. The more investigators examined his movements, the more they realized that Derek had been present in every area where these accidents happened. The truck crashes weren't the result of a distracted driver or bad weather. They were the product of someone who had learned to navigate the silence of the road and exploit it for his own twisted purposes. What struck the investigators as even more unsettling was the fact that Derek had never once been involved in any kind of direct confrontation with the victims. He didn't appear to stop and check for damage, and there were no reports of him calling in any of the crashes. He simply moved on, continuing his routes as though nothing had happened. It became clear that Derek wasn't just driving a truck. He was driving through a nightmare, using his quiet existence to blend into the shadows and remain undetected for years. The full scope of his crimes was still unknown, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Derek Moore wasn't just a trucker. He was a predator, and the roads were his hunting grounds. As the investigation deepened, the authorities began to realize that Derek's movements were no longer just coincidental. They were part of a disturbing pattern. It was as if he had turned the highways into his own private domain, a place where he could remain invisible while leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. The more they pieced together the timeline of the accidents, the more it became apparent that Derek had been systematically evading detection. His routes were consistent, and they always seemed to coincide with the areas where the bodies were found. The police started to suspect that they were dealing with something far more deliberate than a series of random accidents. The most haunting aspect of Derek's crimes was the lack of evidence tying him directly to the scenes. No skid marks, no witnesses, no signs of other vehicles being involved. It was as if Derek had been a ghost, leaving behind only the wreckage of lives he had obliterated. Investigators found it increasingly difficult to understand how he had managed to avoid detection for so long. On the surface, everything about him seemed normal. He was just another trucker, following his schedule and doing his job. But the more they dug into the specifics of the crashes, the more they realized that Derek was no ordinary driver. They soon discovered that Derek had been operating on a night shift, often driving during the late hours when visibility was poor, and the roads were less crowded. The darkness, coupled with his disability, made it easier for him to cause accidents without anyone noticing. While other drivers relied on their hearing to pick up on the sounds of danger, Derek didn't have that ability. The absence of noise created a deadly silence in his world. In fact, it seemed that Derek had learned to use this silence to his advantage, a weapon that allowed him to evade the normal precautions other drivers took. He didn't have to worry about hearing horns, alarms, or the sounds of tires screeching as vehicles swerved to avoid a collision. In his mind, it was as if the world around him was muted, making it easier to slip through unnoticed. The accidents followed a clear trajectory. Derek's truck was always seen near the scene, yet no one could confirm that he had been the one causing the crashes. As investigators dug deeper into the crash sites, they started to find subtle clues that connected Derek to the wreckage. The specific type of truck he drove was consistently spotted at the locations, and his logbooks showed that he was often in the area at the time the crashes occurred. Yet despite all these circumstantial links, Derek's name never appeared in any police reports. He was nothing more than a shadow, lingering just out of reach. The authorities began to focus their attention on the idea that Derek might be the key to unlocking the mystery of the deaths. But it wasn't until they learned more about his background that they began to understand the twisted mind behind the wheel. Derek's past was not as innocent as it appeared. As they traced his movements over the years, they uncovered a history of minor accidents, small fender benders, seemingly harmless incidents that had been swept under the rug. But now, in light of the growing body count, those accidents took on a darker meaning. They were not random mistakes. They were the first signs of something far more sinister. For years, Derek had been flying under the radar, unnoticed and untouched. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that he had been intentionally leaving his mark, quietly moving through the country's highways as his body count rose. Each death was a calculated act, each accident a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Derek Moore was no longer just another truck driver. He was becoming the prime suspect in a series of unspeakable crimes, and the full extent of his deadly actions was only beginning to surface. As the investigation progressed, a breakthrough finally came from an unexpected source. A trucker who had unknowingly shared the road with Derek Moore during some of the deadly incidents. This witness, a long-haul driver named James, had been working late shifts during the time of several crashes. He had seen Derek's truck pass by him on several occasions, often on those desolate stretches of highway where the accidents occurred. Although he didn't think much of it at first, James's recollection of those nights began to take on a darker significance when he was questioned by investigators. James reported seeing Derek's truck, a large, distinctive rig, in the vicinity of several of the crashes just moments before or after they occurred. He remembered the eerie calmness of those nights, how quiet everything felt, with no other trucks in sight, no headlights in the distance, and no sounds other than the hum of the road beneath his tires. The silence on the road was striking, and in retrospect it felt wrong to him. James noted that Derek's truck had always been near the scene, but it never seemed to stop, never seemed to slow down. It was as if Derek was simply moving through the night, leaving the wreckage behind him. The investigators took this new testimony seriously and began to cross-reference James's recollections with Derek's driving logs. They discovered that, indeed, Derek had been scheduled to drive the same routes on the nights when these fatal accidents occurred. The times matched, the routes lined up, and the proximity of Derek's truck to the crashes was undeniable. Still, there was no direct evidence connecting him to the accidents, no physical proof that he was the one causing them. But the pieces were slowly starting to fit together. Next, the authorities turned their attention to Derek's truck. They went over it with a fine-toothed comb, searching for any signs that would tie it to the crashes. After examining the truck's GPS data and reviewing the route logs, they found something disturbing. Derek had been consistently taking high-speed routes at night when few vehicles were on the road. These were often the most dangerous areas to drive, particularly for smaller vehicles that couldn't match the speed of a large truck. Investigators also learned that Derek had become adept at weaving through traffic, choosing routes that made it difficult for other drivers to predict his movements. Despite this mounting evidence, Derek remained unscathed, his name never appearing in any formal investigation reports. He was simply a trucker, following his deliveries with no apparent reason to suspect him of foul play. But the deaths continued to accumulate, and the silence surrounding his presence on the roads became more and more unsettling. There was something methodical about the way Derek moved through the highways, calculated and almost clinical in its precision. As the authorities continued to analyze the data, they began to see an unsettling truth. Derek had been using his position as a truck driver, someone who was largely overlooked by the public, as a shield. His job allowed him to blend into the background, unnoticed by other drivers and law enforcement alike. The fact that he could continue his work while leaving such destruction in his wake made him almost untouchable, like a ghost slipping through the cracks of the system. He was more than just a trucker. He had become a phantom on the road, hiding in plain sight. The question was no longer whether Derek was connected to the deaths, but how he had been able to avoid detection for so long. As the investigation pressed forward, the authorities were faced with a terrifying realization. Derek Moore had turned his silence into a weapon, and now it was time to confront the true horror that lurked behind the wheel. As the investigation into Derek Moore's life continued, the authorities uncovered more pieces of a chilling puzzle. The first discovery was a pattern of strange behavior stretching back years. Derek's past, previously thought to be unremarkable, revealed a series of unsettling incidents that took on a new significance in light of the growing body count. He had always been a solitary figure, preferring the quiet isolation of his truck over social interaction. Friends and family described him as reserved and distant, never one to share much about his personal thoughts or feelings. However, there were occasional hints of something darker beneath the surface. Investigators found that Derek had been involved in several minor accidents before the fatal crashes began. At first they seemed like simple mistakes, parking lot fender benders, slight collisions when maneuvering his truck into tight spaces, but now they were being viewed through a different lens. Looking back, some of these incidents showed a disturbing pattern. Derek had never truly been remorseful about any of them. There were no signs of concern or guilt when he left the scenes. In fact, in many cases, Derek's response was almost mechanical. He would simply report the incident to his employer or move on, as though these minor accidents were just another part of his daily routine. More troubling, however, was the way Derek had isolated himself over the years. As he spent more time on the road, his interactions with others grew fewer and fewer. His friends reported that he rarely spoke about his work, and when he did, it was always in a detached, emotionless tone. He never seemed to form lasting bonds with anyone, choosing instead to disappear into the vast loneliness of the highways. The few family members he had left described him as someone who seemed disconnected from the world, as though he had long ago shut himself off from any meaningful relationships. But what was most chilling was what they discovered when they looked closer at Derek's private life. It turned out that his obsession with control went far beyond his driving habits. Derek had always been fascinated with the idea of power and dominance, particularly when it came to the roads. He had spent hours studying crash reports, memorizing the safest and most dangerous stretches of highways, and learning how to maneuver his truck in ways that would give him a distinct advantage over other drivers. This obsession grew over time, and it wasn't long before Derek began to view the highway as his personal domain, a place where he could act without fear of being caught. The road had become a stage for his twisted sense of control. Derek's disability, which had once seemed like a limitation, now took on a more sinister meaning. His deafness, once seen as a disadvantage by others, allowed him to operate without the usual distractions. He could focus entirely on the task at hand, navigating the roads with a chilling calmness that others couldn't match. While most drivers relied on their hearing to detect danger, to hear the warning signs of nearby vehicles or pedestrians, Derek's world was silent. He didn't need to hear the horns blaring or the tires screeching. In his mind, the roads were his to control, and he was untouchable. The more the authorities learned about Derek's mindset, the more they realized just how dangerous he had become. His actions weren't simply accidents. They were the result of a twisted, calculated plan. Derek had found a way to manipulate the very system, meant to keep the road safe, using his disability as both a shield and a weapon. He had learned to blend into the background, unnoticed by those around him, and use the quiet isolation of his job to carry out his dark desires without ever being detected. Derek Moore had become a predator on the road, and it was becoming increasingly clear that his silence was no accident. The authorities now knew they were dealing with a man who had methodically planned these deaths, using his position as a truck driver to slip through the cracks of the system. The question was no longer how many lives Derek had taken, but how long he could continue to hide in plain sight. As the investigation into Derek Moore's activities intensified, law enforcement began to tighten the net around him. But with each passing day, it became more apparent that catching him wouldn't be easy. The authorities had no direct evidence linking him to any of the deaths, only a mounting trail of circumstantial connections. They knew that Derek had been in the vicinity of multiple crashes, but he had always been a shadow, just another trucker on the highway. His silence, both in his personal life and on the roads, had allowed him to remain unseen for far too long. And why? Their desperation to uncover more, the authorities turned to technology. They knew that Derek's truck would hold the key to uncovering the truth. They began by thoroughly examining the vehicle itself, scrutinizing the GPS tracking system, the dash cams, and the electronic logs. They pulled data from every possible source to see if they could find any discrepancies or inconsistencies in his records. As they dug deeper, something unusual came to light. Derek's GPS system had been deliberately tampered with. The routes he had taken during the critical moments of the crashes had been altered, making it nearly impossible to trace his exact movements. This discovery was a breakthrough. Derek had been one step ahead of the investigators, erasing any clear link between himself and the crash sites. But this wasn't enough to deter the investigators. They had already begun to notice that Derek's behavior was no longer random. He was deliberately orchestrating his route to ensure that he would remain invisible. The knowledge that his movements had been manipulated gave the authorities the determination to keep searching, knowing they were finally on the right track. With this new insight, investigators went back to the scenes of the crashes, carefully analyzing the debris and wreckage left behind. As they began to piece together the details, they started to notice small but significant patterns in the way the accidents occurred. Many of the crashes had been set up to look like isolated incidents, accidents that could have been caused by distracted driving, fatigue, or weather conditions. But something didn't sit right. The positioning of the vehicles, the lack of any evidence that other drivers had been involved, suggested a more intentional cause. It seemed that Derek had been deliberately creating the conditions for these fatal crashes, carefully placing himself in the right spot at the right time, but always managing to escape before anyone could link him to the carnage. The investigators also discovered that Derek had a secret history of visiting secluded spots on his routes, areas known for being dangerous and devoid of witnesses. This gave rise to the chilling possibility that Derek had been stalking these routes for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The authorities now realized that his years of driving were not simply a job. They were part of a carefully crafted plan to carry out his twisted desires. Derek had been playing a deadly game, and he had been winning for a long time. The realization struck like a thunderbolt. Derek Moore had known exactly what he was doing. His silence, once seen as a mere consequence of his disability, was now understood as a tool he had used to his advantage. While others relied on their senses to stay safe on the road, Derek was able to move through the chaos undetected. He was the perfect predator, invisible to the outside world, and the perfect master of his own deadly domain. The authorities were now closer than ever to catching Derek, but they knew that the final steps would be the most difficult. Derek's ability to cover his tracks and disappear into the night had made him a ghost on the road, and they knew they had to be patient. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come crashing down, but they couldn't afford to make a mistake. The hunt for Derek Moore was now a race against time, and every moment brought them closer to a terrifying revelation. The final steps in the investigation were becoming increasingly tense. Law enforcement knew they were closing in on Derek Moore, but the mounting pressure to catch him before he could strike again made each move more dangerous. Derek had proven to be elusive, a master of evading detection. He had carefully manipulated his schedule, altered his routes, and learned to move through the night without leaving a trace. He knew how to cover his tracks, using his deafness to his advantage, ensuring he was always one step ahead of the authorities. It was during one of their final sweeps of his past routes that they uncovered something crucial. Derek had been using a network of payphones scattered along his journey to call in false reports of accidents or traffic hazards. These calls were brief and vague, often made under the cover of darkness, but they had provided just enough confusion for authorities to dismiss any suspicion surrounding the crash sites. The calls were always made shortly after the incidents, and at first they seemed like a coincidence. However, as investigators combed through the data, they realized these calls had been carefully timed to throw off the authorities, ensuring that Derek's truck wouldn't be the first thing they looked for. With this new piece of information, the authorities began to tighten the noose around Derek. They knew his patterns now, and they understood the method behind his madness. They had studied his routes, reviewed his phone records, and checked the data from the payphones he had used. There was no more doubt. Derek Moore was a predator who had been using the highways as his hunting ground for years. The toll of his actions was staggering. 50 lives had been lost, all while Derek had remained hidden in plain sight, expertly covering his tracks, making it seem as if these deaths were nothing more than accidents. Finally, after months of careful planning, the authorities set their trap. They knew Derek's next scheduled route and decided to stake out a particularly isolated stretch of highway that he was known to frequent. The area was known for its dangerous turns and long stretches of empty road, the perfect place for a trucker to disappear into the darkness. The officers waited in the shadows, watching for any sign of Derek's truck. Hours passed, and then, just before dawn, the unmistakable headlights of Derek's rig appeared in the distance. He was following his usual route, unaware that law enforcement had been waiting for him. This was the moment they had been preparing for, and they couldn't afford to let him slip away again. As Derek's truck approached, they moved in, coordinating their efforts with precision to block off all possible escape routes. This time, there would be no mistakes. When they pulled him over, Derek seemed almost indifferent, as if he had been caught in another routine stop. There were no signs of panic, no attempt to flee. The authorities quickly surrounded him, ensuring that he couldn't make a move. As they began questioning him, Derek remained calm, his responses short and detached. It was as if the magnitude of what he had done, what he had become, had never truly registered with him. The authorities were taken aback by how unfazed he seemed, as though he had been prepared for this moment all along. As they took him into custody, it became clear that Derek had never believed he would be caught. He had spent years living in the shadows, taking lives without remorse, and believing that his silence would shield him forever. But now, at long last, the nightmare he had created on the roads was over. The haunting truth was finally being revealed, and the full extent of his crimes was about to unfold. Derek Moore's reign of terror had come to an end, but the shock and horror of what he had done would continue to echo long after his capture. Derek Moore's arrest sent shockwaves through the nation. The quiet trucker, who had lived a life unnoticed by most, was now at the center of one of the most chilling criminal investigations in modern history. As the news of his capture spread, the authorities began the painstaking process of uncovering the full scope of his crimes. What had once seemed like a series of unrelated accidents now revealed itself as the deliberate actions of a methodical killer. But as they interrogated Derek, a chilling realization began to settle in. Derek wasn't just a man who had killed. He was someone who had carefully constructed a facade of normalcy, hiding in plain sight for years. The interrogation room was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Derek sat across from the investigators, his face in a motionless mask, his eyes hollow and distant. He showed no signs of remorse, no indication that he grasped the full weight of his actions. When asked about the deaths, his responses were disturbingly nonchalant. He spoke about the crashes as if they were trivial, almost as if he were discussing a routine part of his job, rather than the destruction of 50 lives. The authorities pressed him further, trying to understand what had driven him to commit such heinous acts. But Derek offered no clear answer. There was no grand motive, no revenge, no clear reason for the carnage he had caused. It seemed as though his actions had been driven by something far darker, an insatiable desire for control, a need to dominate the roads and those who traveled them. However, the prosecution's case was airtight. The evidence of Derek's deliberate actions, his ability to alter his routes and manipulate the systems around him, painted a far more disturbing picture than the defense could ever present. Derek was not a man driven to murder by an inability to communicate or connect with others. He was a man who had found a way to exploit his situation, using his deafness as an advantage to carry out a spree of murders with calculated precision. As the trial continued, Derek remained largely emotionless, offering no defense or explanation for his actions. His detachment from the proceedings only deepened the sense of horror surrounding the case. He showed no remorse, no sign of understanding the magnitude of the destruction he had caused. His silence, which had once been his shield, now felt like a final, cold rejection of any attempt to humanize him. It was as though he had never seen the lives he had destroyed as anything but collateral damage, a mere side effect of the control he had craved over the highways. In the final moments of the trial, the jury deliberated for hours, weighing the overwhelming evidence against the faintest attempts to excuse Derek's actions. It didn't take long before the verdict was reached. Derek Moore was found guilty on all counts of murder. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief, anger, and sadness. The families of the victims, many of whom had spent years wondering who was responsible for their loved ones' deaths, finally had the answers they had been desperately searching for. But even as Derek was led away, shackled and silent, there remained an unsettling truth. Derek's crimes had revealed a dark side of humanity that was not easily explained. In the aftermath of the trial, as Derek was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, the country tried to come to terms with what had happened. The highways, once considered a safe space for millions of drivers, had become a place of fear, and Derek Moore had turned it into his personal hunting ground. His story would become a cautionary tale, one that would remind people of the terrifying truth that sometimes the most monstrous individuals are the ones who hide in plain sight.